When a business is planning and developing a new product or service, one of the technical questions that comes to mind is to use open source or enterprise software. Typically, the team will choose to build the proof of concept or test the waters in open source, and then choose whether to continue to build on top of the open source software or continue with the enterprise supported software. In this episode, we'll cover what things you should consider, whether you are a developer, architect, or DevOps engineer, when provisioning and clustering open source Redis and Redis Enterprise. Let's get started. When getting started with using Redis in a new product or service, the first thing you'll need to decide is how to deploy it. From a developer's perspective, installing open source Redis is very simple and takes very little time. However, once developers start to build more robust applications that need to go into production, then DevOps needs to step in and standardize the deployment process as much as possible. Especially as each developer team typically has varying requirements for their particular node or cluster, like what data types they need, the level of security required, and the size of the node or cluster and expected operations per second. Provisioning Redis open source is going to require a lot of manual setup to configure these nodes or clusters. And of course, if you don't want to maintain that level of manual effort, custom scripts will need to be created to replace this manual overhead effort and maintenance. Let's take a look at what some of these tasks look like in Redis open source. After spinning up a node, the first thing that you'll want to do is secure it. Depending on the developer or developer team requiring the node, the security requirements could vary widely, like having no security or authentication set up at all, so they can test without any blockers in an uncontrolled environment, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, a very controlled environment, even separated from the external internet. Once you have these requirements on how to provision the node and its security, there are some things to consider. We have an entire episode on security and access management in this Tech Talk series. In fact, it's the episode right after this one, but since security is a core part of provisioning Redis, I'll encourage you to watch that episode. Since Redis open source is often very simple to exploit because by default it binds to all interfaces and has no authentication. Once you have resolved the security requirements, usability of Redis should be something you should consider, as most developers won't want to access Redis through the CLI, rather their preferred language. With over 50 clients including Go, Java, Node.js, and Python, provisioning Redis open source with the desired client library for the preferred programming language is a must. Okay, the Redis instance is secured and usable. The next thing that you'll need to do is add persistence. Redis open source provides a range of persistence options so that you can persist your data to a durable storage, like Redis database or RDB, also known as snapshotting, append-only file or AOF, or a combination of the two. It's important to know that the default configuration for Redis open source is not very durable. Redis open source will only spontaneously save the dataset from time to time. For example, after at least 5 minutes if you have at least 100 changes in your data. So if your developer team wants the database to persist and be reloaded after a restart, this is a step you won't want to miss. The question of whether you should do RDB, AOF, or a combination of the two is a question for the developer team on what degree of time frame of lost data is acceptable. We generally recommend using both methods if you want a degree of durability similar to a traditional RDBMS. Configuring a single Redis node with RDB and AOF doesn't take much time or effort, as I'll show you, but doing so for a multitude of nodes or clusters will slow down your provisioning, which in the end slows down development time. For RDB, simply use the save command to create a dump.rdb file. Note that saving on an extensive dataset is not recommended because it will block all other clients until the save is complete. To avoid this, you can use the bgsave command that will perform the backup in the background using a child process that does not block other clients. To configure a bgsave operation for a given period of time and writes, simply call save 60 10,000, which will trigger a bgsave operation if 10,000 writes have occurred within 60 seconds as an example. For AOF, you can turn it on in your configuration file with append only yes. Note, you can adjust how often the syncing will occur from always for every single write to every second for appending every second. Lastly, being able to provision a Redis instance into production is what the focus is on our last section. Clustering to take care of scalability and some degree of availability. A major consideration is to determine if you will be using a standalone Redis server versus a cluster of Redis servers is crucial. A standalone Redis open source server has no scalability and high availability, which means you'll have growing pains of not enough performance, causing latency, too little memory, and no automatic failover. Redis open source's solution to this is a Redis cluster. A Redis open source cluster allows you to partition the database into smaller parts in order to allow horizontal scaling, also known as sharding. A minimum of 3 primary shards are required to create a quorum, which means you will need to set up and configure 3 Redis servers, which, as we've covered so far, takes manual effort and quite a bit of time. After you've validated your installation and configuration of your Redis servers, you can create the cluster by running this command. The first 3 addresses are the primary nodes, and the next 3 addresses are the replica nodes. The cluster replicas 1 argument indicates that each primary will have 1 replica. The output should be similar to this. Type yes and press enter to accept the configuration, and then you'll get the configuration details once again in the output. Okay, so from a developer perspective, we're thinking we have a scalable and highly available Redis cluster. We're good to go, right? Well, not so fast. The scalability and high availability are there, yes, but it is not automated. The developers managing this cluster will continue to spend time and resources right-sizing the cluster for performance, high availability, and available space for scalable growth. And from a DevOps perspective, provisioning a number of these configured clusters that are ready to be put into production takes quite a bit of time, not to mention the lack of automation and overhead we'll need to manage them. Let's move on to Redis Enterprise, where I'll show you how to take the operational admin out of Redis. Provisioning a Redis Enterprise database is really quick and easy to do, no matter the requirements. On Redis Enterprise Cloud, there are a number of configurable options available, like what cloud vendor you want the database to be set up on, what region, whether or not you want to reduce costs with our Redis on Flash implementation, and many more. In the advanced options, you can choose whether you want your database to replicate to multiple availability zones with automatic failover or not. I always have that enabled. And even VPC configuration that allows you to see which subnet your Redis Enterprise database will be deployed. Next, we can directly fit our database or databases to the needs of the developer or developer team. We can set the throughput needed by setting the number of operations per second or shards we need and the total memory limit. And high availability will enable replication spanning multiple nodes with automatic failover. Not the same as the multiple availability zones option that was on the setup page beforehand. Whether we want the Redis open source cluster API enabled to reduce access times and latency by providing a simple mechanism for Redis clients to know the cluster topology, which removes the use of single DNS endpoints and provides more ease of use for your Redis Enterprise database. Then we have quite a few data persistence options for both append-only file and snapshotting. Finally, modules. I'll enable Redis search, Redis JSON, and Redis time series. It is as simple as that. After provisioning the number of databases that are required with the necessary configurations, you can review and create and then send those endpoints out to those developer teams. That took less than 2 minutes to do, which is pretty incredible. You might be wondering, what about clustering though, right? Because we are taking the Redis admin out of the equation, with Redis Enterprise Cloud, you won't have to self-manage anything in regards to the clustering. When you scale beyond what a single shard can hold, then additional ones are provisioned, providing infinite linear scalability without having to raise a finger. Security is taken care of with the shared responsibility model we have with the cloud provider you have chosen. In addition, we can very easily set up appropriate rules for team members with access and enable multi-factor authentication. For the database itself, there are several options for security, like encryption at rest, role-based access control, network security with IP restrictions and use of VPCs, TLS, and lastly, network security, using VPC peering and classless inter-domain routing or CIDR whitelist. We breezed over that, but don't worry, we dive into all of those items in our next episode, Security and Access Management. With Redis Enterprise software outside of the cloud, it is far less complex than Redis open source as well. Redis Enterprise software is designed specifically to simplify operations while providing seamless scalability, the top performance you can expect with Redis, and high availability. Each cluster node can be physical or virtual, with various in-memory storage devices and computing cores. This freedom and flexibility of configuration allows you to roll out clusters that most efficiently use your resources. In regards to clustering with Redis Enterprise software, the cluster manager consists of a number of components in the background that monitor and configure the many Redis instances that make up a cluster. The cluster manager handles resharding, rebalancing, auto failover, rack awareness, database provisioning, resource management, data persistence, backup and recovery, quite a list. All done seamlessly, once again taking the operator out of the equation to allow more time and resources to be focused on the things that matter most to your engineering organization. Now you have a secured, usable, persistent Redis database that is going to auto-scale based on your individual data needs, and you have a white-gloved managed service route with Redis Enterprise Cloud, and a more hands-on and configurable route with Redis Enterprise software. Which one is best for you? Well, it depends on your business, application, and data layer requirements, but there really is no better place to get an enterprise-level Redis database than with Redis Enterprise. Next, I had the pleasure of sitting down with one of our customers, Chris Lim, who is the founder of Theotech and SPF.io, which is a real-time captioning and translation software. We discussed his journey going from starting his business on Redis open source to moving it all over to Redis Enterprise. Let's take a look. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you joining. But first, before we get started, maybe we could get an introduction from yourself and tell us a little bit about your company.
Sure. Thanks, Talon. My name is Chris Lim. I am the founder of Spiffio, SPF.io, which is an all-in-one platform for translation and accessibility. Our vision is to make every event accessible in any language. And we've done that from everything as small as a baby shower that needed translation, all the way up to churches that do it every week, all the way up to international conferences that serve tens of thousands of people. And so that's our vision. Excited to be able to be on this Tech Talk and share a little bit about how we've used Redis to make this experience possible.
Yeah, we've talked before, and so I'm a little bit familiar with your journey from Redis open source to Redis Enterprise, but let's get our audience well informed. So you started your company with Redis open source, as many do in the early stages. Tell us more about the growing pains or signs you were noticing that made you think, let's move Redis into an enterprise solution.
So the basic reason why I chose Redis, I came from an Amazon background before I started my company, and I just really like the simplicity of Redis. These data structures are easy to understand, and the database is so fast that it let me iterate quickly to be able to do, my version 1.0, 1.5, whatever of Spiffio as a product. But what happened is that it had grown to the point where we were kind of hitting the memory limits of the way that I had done the deployment. And since it was time to either, scale up vertically or scale out horizontally for my application layer, I decided to talk to Redis Enterprise and see like, hey, what are my options here and how can that make a difference for me? The growing pains were basically, we just had enough customers growing an application using more of the memory limits that we had on our database.
Mm-hmm.
And so we needed to look for a solution. And because I'm a startup, I didn't want to do database operations. I'd rather find a managed solution for our needs, because it's better to pay for that than it is to have to hire headcount to run this database for what we needed. So that's what happened. But I will tell you the fun story behind how we ended up really needing to upgrade how I was running Redis. And I'll just be open about everything here. I was running Redis basically, and my team was running Redis basically side by side in a Docker container with our application layer. So we had no latency issues because it's running on the same host, very fast and performant. But the only way to really scale it out would have been to get a bigger host. And what happened was I was noticing we're reaching those memory limits, and I thought we had runway. I thought it would be okay. And as Murphy's Law would have it, or I don't know if it's Murphy's Law, but basically on the day of my bachelor party, I got married last year. About an hour before the bachelor party was going to start, my pager, I didn't have a pager, but my alarm started to go off saying something was wrong. My database can't write anymore in my production environment. And I was panicking and like, okay, I don't know what's going to happen. But my best man, who is a really top-notch engineer for a major tech company, he came through for me. He's the one who organized the bachelor party. And that hour before, we both logged into the host, figured out what was going on, pinpointed the issue. Basically, the Redis instance was configured to not write if it was no longer able to do a BG save, because I was out of memory. And so through that, we were able to stabilize it. What I ended up doing was, I forgot, I may have ended up cleaning up a bunch of data as much as I could to free up some more space, but I didn't want to do the upsizing of the instance at that time. So I was able to clean up enough for us to be able to make it through the night, bachelor party, no issues. But later on the first day of my honeymoon, I had to ask my wife for permission to like work a little bit so I could do the scaling. And so upgraded to a host with double the memory size and everything like that. And that gave us more runway so that we could basically, the software could continue to run just fine. So that's a crazy story. Definitely don't recommend it for anyone else, but it was crazy fun. And I can tell this story on your show. But that aside, that was the time when we said, okay, we calculated out our runway and said, we really need to prioritize moving to a hosted solution. And so that's what started my journey towards looking for, comparing options, whether it was like Amazon's MemoryDB or Redis Enterprise, and just seeing what was possible out there. And I think at the time, Redis Enterprise was having a promo for basically winning a Tesla. So I was like, you know what, might as well talk to you guys at that time. Fortunately, I didn't win, but it was still a great opportunity to connect with Michael on your team and basically figure out how you guys could help our company to grow.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining me on this Tech Talk. We really appreciate it. You have lots of stories and experiences that really show the story or the journey from Redis open source to Redis Enterprise. If you'd like to know more about Spiffio, you can go to spf.io and learn more there. And with that said, thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chris, for taking the time to sit down and chat about your journey from Redis open source to Redis Enterprise. It was really insightful. No matter the size and maturity of your company, we all run into the same steps of implementing a technical solution like Redis. The effort, resources, and time required to build Redis open source from the ground up are significant, but that isn't the only route that is available to get the real-time power of Redis. Well, that covers our look at provisioning and clustering inside both Redis open source and Redis Enterprise. Redis open source is a really great start on getting real-time capabilities inside of your product or service. But Redis Enterprise brings all of the things you already love about Redis, but with an enterprise-ready environment. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and look forward to seeing you in our other Tech Talks. Thanks.